We will now have a dramatic reading of the Old Testament scripture in Exodus 16. So if all of our actors and readers might come forward.
As soon as the Israelites got to the desert, the entire community complained to Moses and Aaron.
Look, I will cause bread to rain down from heaven for you, and you will go out and gather a helping of it each day. I will test you to see if you are willing to live by my instructions. On the 6th day, you will gather the usual amount, but when you go to prepare it, it will be twice what you usually gather.
Tell the entire community to gather near God.
While Aaron was speaking to the entire community, they all looked out toward the desert, and the radiant glory of God could be seen in the cloud. Then God spoke to Moses.
Rest assured, I have heard the constant complaining of the people. Tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have enough bread to satisfy your gnawing hunger. Then you will know that I am God.
That evening, quail flew in and covered the camp. And when morning arrived, what seemed to be ordinary dew was all around the camp. But when the dew evaporated, it left behind a thin, mysterious, flaky substance that looked like frost on top of the dry desert ground. The people went out to examine it. They had never seen anything quite like it.
What is it?
The people didn't have a clue what this strange substance was.
It is the bread which God has given you to eat. Here are his instructions. Gather only as much as you should need to eat by yourself. Pick 2 quarts of bread for each person who lives in your tent.
The people did as they were told. Some people gathered a lot, others gathered less. When they used a 2-quart jar to measure it, the one who had gathered a lot didn't have more than he needed, and the one who gathered less had just what he needed. Miraculously, each person and each family, regardless of how much they gathered, had exactly what they needed.
Don't try to keep any of it until the morning. Eat it all or throw it away.
But some people ignored Moses and tried to keep some of it until the next morning. Overnight, it became wormy and started to have a dreadful smell. Moses became furious with them because they had disobeyed God's instructions. Every morning, people went out and gathered it. Each family took only what was needed. By the time the sun became hot, it had melted away. On the 6th day, the people went out and gathered, but they came back with twice as much as usual, 4 quarts per person.
Listen to what God has commanded. Tomorrow is the 7th day, is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath dedicated to God. Bake or boil whatever you need for today's meals. Whatever is left over, keep to eat tomorrow. It will not spoil.
So the people stored some of it until the next morning, just as Moses had instructed. None of it spoiled, nor did it have worms. The community decided to name this mysterious substance manna, which means, what is it? It was white, like a coriander seed, and it tasted sweet like honey wafers. For 40 years, the people were sustained by the manna God supplied.
Thanks be to God. When I adopted my first greyhound, I found myself in a new world. I had to take care of a creature that didn't talk to me, and I really didn't quite know what was going on, because after about a week, she started pooing all over the house. I couldn't figure it out. She was 2 years old, and I walked her every day. So what was the problem? She also woke me up in the middle of the night, and so I would get up out of bed, and I'd let her out, and then she'd come back in. And after about 2 or 3 weeks of this, I started feeling like I was being taken advantage of, that maybe perhaps she was trying to manipulate me. This is before I learned that doggy brains are smaller than human brains. Anyway, I decided that I would close the bedroom door so she could not come in, and that I would let her cry all night long, and I was not going to give her what she wanted, which was to take her outside, because I wanted to teach her that she couldn't just get anything she wanted by crying. Well, the next morning, I woke up, and guess what? There was poo in the house yet again, and this time it was by the furnace. So I marched her right over to that furnace, and I showed her that poo like I would a child, and I put her nose in it, and then I said no, and then I slapped her across the muzzle. I felt terrible. I'd already been told that greyhounds are very sensitive creatures, and so I called up the greyhound rescue people, and I said, okay, she's been pooing in the house now for 2 weeks, and I did this, and I finally got up to the part in the story that I was really embarrassed about, which was when I slapped her across the muzzle. And the lady on the other end of the line just said, well, did the slapping help? And I said, no. And she said, well, is she sick? This had never occurred to me. Yeah. And so I said, I don't know. And she says, well, you should take her to the vet. She might have worms. And so I decided to do that. I took her to the vet, and guess what? She had worms. And so as soon as we got her worms cured, no more pooing in the house. That first year with Rusty was pretty tough. We were trying to understand each other. I understanding her because she couldn't talk, and she understanding what in the world I was trying to do with her. But we got through it pretty well. And we learned a little bit at a time to trust one another. And finally, after a time, I realized that she knew I loved her, and I knew she loved me too. Well, this story we heard today, and we saw enacted out on the stage here behind the communion table, is the story of the manna in the wilderness. And it's a story of the first time God decided to take a journey with the people into the wilderness. They had gotten there, you see, after they had crossed the promised land, and the Lord they had basically been driven into the wilderness because they crossed the Red Sea, and well, let's just say that's all that there was there across the sea. So at first everything was fine because they went to this oasis called Elim, and they had some food to eat there. And then, of course, they'd also brought provisions along with them. But after about 6 weeks, they ate their way through all of the provisions. And there was no food. They were really at their wits' end, like you saw up here. Can you imagine being in the middle of nowhere, and there's no way to grow food, and you don't know where any is? Well, the people were really, really angry. They cried out to God because they wanted to have something to eat. And then we hear that story, that wonderful story of how they are fed. You see, this wilderness that they went to, I know when I was younger, I thought they just kind of got lost. Well, that's probably because I always get lost. But I thought that maybe the people of Israel were wandering around because they were lost in the wilderness. I think I may have been taught that in Sunday school too. But you know, when you look at the story carefully, you can see that they were actually forced into the wilderness by God. They weren't lost. They were in a place that God had taken them to. So why would God want them to be in a wilderness? Why would God want any of us to be in a wilderness? And I know many of you, probably all of you, have been in one kind of wilderness or another, maybe several times in your life. Places that you didn't want to end up in. Maybe it's an illness, or maybe it's the loss of a loved one, or it could be disillusionment about what you're doing, or there's so many things that drive us into a wilderness. Even an unkind word can do it. Why would God want us there? Well, a wilderness is a place in between. And for the people of Israel, the wilderness was the place in between slavery and freedom. While when they were in Egypt, that wasn't a wilderness. Egypt was a place where they were slaves. They didn't have to worry about anything in Egypt. They were fed. They were taken care of. Why? Because they were used as tools. And as slaves, they had to be fed because they had to do something for someone else. They didn't have time to worry about freedom. They just wanted to get through the day. They just wanted to survive. But God didn't want God's people to be like that. God didn't want the people to just be thinking about survival. God wanted people to be free. And so, God brought them into that wilderness so that they could be free. And how were they going to learn how to be free? The way we all did. They were going to be fed. How did we all take our first meal? Right? We did not know what food was, of course. Just like the people they didn't know what this was. Manna? They called it, what is it? When we were young, when we were first born, we were brought to our mother's breast and held in the safety of the arms of our parents. We received our first meal. And we received enough. We didn't receive more than we needed. And we didn't receive less than we needed, probably. We received enough. And then we started getting used to the fact that when we got hungry, which was pretty often when we were little, we could cry. We could cry out, and guess what? Mom would come back. We would be back in her arms. We would be fed again. And that's how we learned trust. And trust is the very backbone of freedom. So God wanted to teach the people in the wilderness trust. Simple trust. Like the kind of trust we learned when we were a babe in our mother's arms. The children of Israel, when they entered the wilderness, were like newborn babies. They were brand new. And by the way, that is how God sees us all the time. I'm sure you've noticed that in the scripture, we're never called teenagers of God or adults of God or vice presidents of God. What are we called? Children of God. We never stop being children of God in the Bible. And so when the people entered the wilderness with God, they were like newborn children, crying out. And then they were fed. But of course, they were going to get hungry again, right? So God fed them again and instructed them, eat only what you need. There's always going to be enough. If you try to store up anything, because you don't think I'm going to feed you the next time, it's going to look like this. Yuck. Food is always fresh at mother's breast. And the food was always fresh in the wilderness for the people. And that is how they learned to be free. They learned to be free by depending on God. It was a very hard lesson to learn, a very hard lesson for us to learn too. But that is how we can fully be children of God. But there's always a but in these sermons, as you know. Most of us don't go on like that. We prefer to put our comfort and our trust in another way of life. It, by the way, is also a form of slavery. We want to trust in things. We want to trust that we can control things, hold them, deposit them into CDs so that we will have larger bank accounts. We want to trust in promotions. We want to trust in all the things that the world has to offer us. Things that are wonderful to the eye, but nothing to the soul. So we trade. We make a trade. Yeah, trusting in God's really kind of scary, you know, especially on your really bad days. Better to have health insurance, plenty of money in the bank, friends that surround you. But we trade our precious freedom that God gave us, that we have when we trust in God, for things, for actions, for stuff that we can control. Many years ago, my friend Morgan shared with me a poem that I now read at the beginning of every new year. And it goes like this. If, like Herod, we put our trust in things and again in things, if we believe that we are so unimportant that we have to fill our very lives with action and more action, when will we have time to make that long, slow journey across the desert? Or to look up at the stars and gaze at them as the shepherds did? Or to ponder the life, the new life that is coming to be within us as Mary did? For each one of us, there is a star to find, a desert to cross, and a being inside of us that we must bring to life. And we do that in the wilderness. Rusty and I had a very good life together, some 14 years. There were still difficult times after that first year, and we had our struggles, but I stayed with her until she closed her eyes. And after a few years, I realized that not only had I rescued Rusty, she rescued me too. Our trust in each other is complete. We are all God's children. We are free. We have been rescued. And we belong not to things, not to what the world entices us to have, not to slavery. We belong to freedom. We belong to God, and God alone.